In this next section, what we're going to do is look at some specific examples of where influence has been made, and particularly the effects that those have had as well. So, of course, one of the first things that whenever someone's making a claim, giving you evidence or anything like that, you need to have a think about, are there any conflicts of interest? Who's making the claim? Where did the money come from? What are the links? So if you look, and when you investigate Andrew Wakefield's and vaccine study, trying to link MMR to autism, one of the things that came about from that as well is that it was eventually discovered that he and his team received money from a law firm that was suing vaccine manufacturers. And so in that case there, if he's getting money from someone who's trying to get money from someone else, the research isn't necessarily going to be valid, or it's going to pick data, it's going to cherry pick data. And it's a really important thing to think about. And so when it comes to scientific evidence, there's often a couple of ways that information can be manipulated. The first one is suppression. And so in suppression, what you do is just try and hide evidence. And so this is something that particularly the tobacco manufacturers in the latter part of the 20th century tried to do. There was a huge amount of data, there was a huge amount of evidence that smoking caused lung cancer. Today it's something we accept. However, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, they were suppressing that information. They were doing a lot of studies themselves, which seemed to not corroborate everything else. Also, what they did is put out misinformation. As I sort of just briefly mentioned there, they even set up and paid scientists to do research. And that research deliberately caused a little bit of confusion. And so when they were doing things, they were called into the US Congress about this, and that they could quote studies that they themselves had paid for, which tried to dilute the influence of cigarette smoking on things like lung disease. And it's, even though the two things are doing the same thing, they are trying to influence people and do that there. Suppression is essentially getting rid of the information. Misinformation is putting up stuff that confuses people often. And as we said there, this idea of the tobacco industry, misinformation suppression, and you've got down here some of their own quotes that their idea of scientific proof was about trying to say, well, that it's not 100% that there is a cause, and this idea of really trying to discredit the idea of that it's a personal judgment. Now, also what we have there is that from once that successful cigarette tactic worked, we then get into things like fossil fuels. And of course, we now have unequivocal proof that there is climate change going on. And companies like Exxon, one of the world's biggest fossil fuel producers, they know that there is an influence. They also funded organizations that produced scientific reports that cast doubt on climate change. Now, of course, we are moving away from that there. Most fuel companies, most of these energy producers are now seeing that there's money to be made in renewable resources. But the damage is unfortunately still done. Going back historically as well, around the same time as the lung cancer debate, there was asbestos. Now, asbestos is a natural material. It used to be mined out of the ground. And one of the things there is that it was known to cause lung cancer. And so what it does is that in your normal lungs, just very, very healthy. But in in a person that's suffering from asbestos related disease, their lungs get damaged because asbestos is a tiny, tiny inorganic fiber, a naturally occurring crystal. And when these little fine particles get into your lungs, because they're inorganic, your immune system can't get rid of them. It can't break them down. It can't do anything with them. And so they sit in your lungs and then cause problems. And so, eventually you get to a point where there is cancer formed, there's scar tissue, your lungs no longer function. And of course, this had been known for a very, very long time. One of the big companies in Australia, Hardy Industries, knew about it, and it's only in the last couple of decades where they've acknowledged and moved on. Now, of course, there's also issues when companies try and get products to market, and there's a couple of or there's plenty of interesting examples there, and often companies try and get their product to market as soon as possible because obviously there's money to be made. One infamous case in the United States involved a chemical or a product called Alestra. Alestra was discovered, it was an artificial synthetic fat. And so, what it is, if you cooked something in Alestra, it had the taste, it had the texture of something normally cooked in oil. But because it was synthetic, your body did not recognize it. So Alestra essentially passed directly through the body without being metabolized. And how this product got to market is quite interesting, but they had to have warnings. So this is on a chip warning packet saying you may get abdominal cramping, loose stools, essentially diarrhea. They had a phrase for it called anal leakage. And so, it was your body just without your consent would release part of the Alestra. Also going back to the mid 21st century, DDT. DDT is a product that was used to get rid of insects, an insecticide. And of course, at the time, people thought, oh, this is really good, DDT. As this little lad from probably the 40s or the 50s says, it's good for everyone. Except it's not good. It can actually cause a lot of very, very bad health risks for individuals who consume it. And particularly for humans, where if the DDT spread here and you're eating your tomato, you're eating your beef, you're eating I'm assuming that's a potato there next to the chicken, the DDT actually bioaccumulates in the flesh, in the biological product, which means you can actually get quite sick from it. And of course, one of the things there, in the American ecosystem, one of their biggest things there is they love, things like eagles. And, if the DDT gets in the water, you got your little zooplankton, gets eaten by a fish, goes to a big fish, goes to this eagle. And the eagle in North America was almost wiped out because it was being killed by biomagnification of the DDT in their food source.